Hello, everyone, and welcome to Franz's Real Estate Facts, episode 25. We are almost 6 months or half a year into me gabbing with really awesome guests every week, telling us interesting real estate facts that are important to homeowners. And, recently I was invited to a house party because COVID is kind of going away and it's summer and it's nice and people have backyards. And they're like, hey, why don't you come over to my house and we'll have a party? And I was like, that's awesome. And me being a lawyer and seeing somebody with like, I don't know, 20 people in their house, I was like, huh, what kind of legal liability might they run into because they're a homeowner? Like if somebody falls in their pool while they're drunk and they drown, like does the homeowner have liability there? Like what's going on? And so, in light of that, I thought, you know who I can talk to about this? Jessica Sizemore. And Jessica Sizemore is a friend of mine and is also a partner at Gomez Trial Attorneys, and she handles personal injury matters. She has extensive trial experience. I think she's been a lawyer for longer than I would care to admit, just because, it probably is a little bit easier for her not to know how many years, but it is enough years that she's had extensive trial experience working with premises liability cases. And so the first question I will have for you, Jessica, is premises liability cases sounds like this really fancy legal term. So for our viewers who may or may not know what fancy legal terms are and what those fancy legal terms mean, what are premises liability cases?
Thank you, Frantz. First, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on today. I really appreciate it. I think this is going to be really fun. But to get to your question about premises liability cases, realistically, all that means is, does somebody have liability for an injury that happened on a property? So either a commercial property or a residential property or some type of property that somebody owns, does somebody have a liability for somebody else getting injured on that property? And so that typically requires that a plaintiff prove, so someone who's bringing a lawsuit would have to prove that the individual was negligent in their use and maintenance of that property. And that's a very, very wide net, and there's a ton of different ways that you could be negligent in the use and maintenance of your property.
Okay. And liability just means you will be writing a check. Or
essentially, yeah. Are you
or
responsible? I think responsibility is a better way to maybe put it. And that typically, like you said, comes down to financial responsibility.
right. Somebody, either your homeowner's insurance policy or you or your very rich friend that you go bag will be writing a check
Yes.
to the
Are you
person.
financially responsible for that person's injuries?
Exactly. So, I mean, in your experience, I was obviously at a party and I was like, okay, well, maybe these people are going to be liable if somebody falls in their pool and drowns. But like, where does liability really come in for homeowners? Like, when do homeowners get sued for their negligence? Like, is it usually people who are their friends who like drown in pools, or is it like something else? Like, I don't know, maybe somebody walking on the sidewalk and then they fall and hit their head and then are in a wheelchair for the rest of their lives?
So it can actually be all of the above. I will say in practice, typically it's the kind of third party, the person who's unrelated to, if we're limiting it to a homeowner, it's most often people are kind of unrelated, just that's in practice. But realistically, it can be anyone that you invite onto your property. And if you are negligent, meaning that you are doing something that a reasonably careful person would not do, or failing to do something that a reasonably careful person would do, again, very, very broad, but that just means that you're negligent. And if you are negligent in how you use your property and somebody is injured, then you may be on the hook for that.
Okay. And what are some examples of negligence, like leaving the garden hose on the grass or?
Yeah, so I mean, that could be an example if you created some type of slippery situation and someone slipped and fell. That's kind of one of the broad categories of personal injury that everyone knows, right, is the slip and fall and the trip and fall. And so that's pretty common on a premises case. So if someone's injured on a property, it may be a slip and fall or a trip and fall. One of the other examples for a trip and fall might be, you are failing to maintain the sidewalk in front of your home. Let's say you maybe have root intrusion from a tree that's on your property, and you are aware of that and have notice of that, and it's your responsibility to maintain that tree, and that sidewalk is raised and someone trips on it, you may be liable in that sense. If you left that garden hose on and it created a slippery condition and someone slipped and fell in it, that may be something that you're liable for. You used a good example before, pool. If you had a pool that was unsafe in some way, maybe it didn't have a gate around it when it should have, maybe you had noticed that it was unreasonably dangerous in some way, you could be liable for that. And so, another one is the tree situation. If you had a tree that you were failing to maintain properly and it was dropping leaves all over the sidewalk that were unusually slippery. There are some leaves that have certain types of flowers on them that can create slippery conditions for people. You could have another classic case of a slip and fall there. So there's a ton of different ways that you could be liable. And really, it just kind of all goes back to, are you maintaining your property in a reasonably safe condition? And so there's so many different ways that you could technically be liable for failures to maintain your property. And that's why it's really, really important to just make sure that you're keeping your property up in tip-top shape and that you're not creating any undue hazards anywhere.
Yeah, that is really, really helpful to know. And I mean, I think, we both went to law school, right? And so there's this idea of the reasonable person, and you kept talking about a reasonable person and what would a reasonable person do. Does a reasonable person actually do reasonable things, or is this just like a legal fiction?
Yeah, so the reasonable man is a legal fiction. I agree. It's essentially what a jury would determine is reasonable. And so it may be different in front of 12 different sets of people. If you have 12 jurors on a jury, they would then decide what is reasonable under the circumstances. And there's a lot of different factors that would come into place. What is the likelihood of people coming onto the property and encountering this hazard? If it's something that is very, very unlikely for someone to encounter that hazard, then the reasonableness scale may be completely different than if it's something that people are regularly encountering. And so there's a lot of factors that go into whether conduct is reasonable or unreasonable, but really it's kind of a gut instinct that a juror would decide. And it really is just, did you do something or fail to do something that most reasonable people would do? So
Right.
You're not asking the property owner to go above and beyond and go completely crazy about every safety risk that could possibly potentially be on their property. But you also need to realize that if something is reasonably dangerous and you have the ability to correct it and you notice it and don't correct it, then you may have liability there.
Right. And so I think kind of your example is like, I think of the difference between somebody who lives maybe in like Ramona or Campo and somebody who lives in Hillcrest, right? There's like, nice houses in Ramona, there's nice houses in Hillcrest. If you have like a giant tree in Ramona and it has like all of these roots, how many people are walking in front of your house in Ramona? Probably not that many, depending on where you live. If you live in Hillcrest, on what is it, Robinson Avenue, there's some really nice houses over there, right? And there's a sidewalk and people are walking along the sidewalk to go to the bars and the restaurants and everything. And if there is like tree root intrusion and then the sidewalk is buckling, probably a reasonable person would fix it, or a jury would say, you see people walking by your house all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And really, it just kind of goes to that issue of, notice, and is it reasonable for you? Is it foreseeable that somebody's going to come across this danger and trip on it? And so that kind of all ties into this idea of what's the likelihood that someone's going to be harmed? The more likely that someone's going to be harmed, the probably lesser degree of negligence that you may need. Now, if it's something that somebody is very, very unlikely to come across, a jury may find that it's a little bit more reasonable to allow that dangerous condition to exist. But, at the end of the day, you really just want to err on the side of caution and make sure that, when you notice dangerous conditions on your property and you know that they could harm somebody, that you're just doing something about it. And, it may be as simple as putting up a warning or putting up some kind of signage. Is that reasonable under the circumstances? Maybe, depending on the condition. But, doing something is always better than doing nothing.
Yeah. And also, I think one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of, reasonableness is, if you're the plaintiff's attorney, then it is entirely reasonable to hire like a geological specialist to, look at the soil conditions and determine how likely it is that this tree root intrusion is going to like cause a 1 millimeter sort of shift in the sidewalk. And if you're the defense attorney, then it's entirely reasonable that you have a 50-foot pothole in the middle of your sidewalk and you did nothing about it for 25 years.
Absolutely. And, that really is going to be the arguments you're going to see on both sides. Certainly, a defense attorney is going to say that it's reasonable to ignore a certain threshold of danger. And a plaintiff's attorney is going to say the slightest danger you have to act upon. And you're going to see that. But like I said, if you are a homeowner and you're concerned about your liability, it's always best to err on the side of caution and just make sure that you don't have dangers on your property.
Exactly. That is super, super helpful to know. And so the other question that I had was sort of something along the lines of criminal activity on your property. So, when you are, if you're a homeowner, if you have, say, tenants, right, who are maybe doing some stuff that they shouldn't be doing in their property, and maybe it causes a fire and it burns down, the house next door, or, you have like this really nice liquor cabinet and you have a 15 or 16-year-old and that they like having parties, and then they bring all of their friends over and their friends get drunk and maybe they hurt somebody while they do that. Like, what is the potential for you as a homeowner when people do stuff that they should not be doing on your property and you kind of maybe should have known they were going to do that?
Yeah, and so it really comes down to that last thing that you said is, did the homeowner have either know or have a reason to know that there was potentially some kind of third party criminal conduct? And that's typically kind of how we look at it. Is certainly if you are a commercial property owner and you're inviting, the public onto your property, or if you're a landlord and you have, tenants on your property, and there is some level of foreseeable criminal conduct, you can definitely be on the hook for that. And then if you're talking about your run-of-the-mill homeowner and like the situation you said, where they're allowing, let's say, a minor to be drinking on the property, and that minor then goes out and either they get injured or that minor goes out and injures somebody else, there could be liability in those certain circumstances. And so, you may have the duty also to control conduct that's not even yours or not even necessarily a product of the property itself, but rather what you're allowing to happen on the property. And so it comes down to this idea: was it foreseeable that this conduct was occurring, and did you have the opportunity to do something about it?
Right.
And certainly if you are a landlord or a commercial property owner and you're inviting the public onto your property and something happens, you may have a little bit more of an increased duty to make sure that it's safe.
And you mentioned this idea of inviting people onto your property or inviting strangers onto your property. The thing that comes up for me as I think about it is just like when you list your home and you're inviting strangers onto your property to view the home. And like the one thing that I remember is I was listing agent on some property, and there was a I don't, it was kind of weird the way it was structured. So there was like a sort of threshold at the front and then a sharp drop to the living room. And there was like one stair there or something, but it wasn't clear. It was short or something about it just made everybody trip when they came there. And I remember the appraiser, like I was there for the appraisal, and the appraiser actually came and sort of stepped off this ledge and fell, right? Um, I mean, my clients didn't get sued and nothing happened, but I had told them, you know what you should do? You should put like a cone here and like a sign and a cone and a sign and maybe even like just a barrier to stop people from stepping on this and falling. And they're like, it's not a problem. And I just like, sent them an email and I was like, hey, I would advise you to do this. And then they didn't do it. And this guy fell. So if he had been more injured, right, there is entirely a possibility that he would have been, that they would have been liable for failing to
I
do
100%
something.
agree, and particularly because there's a very good argument that they're on notice that there's a dangerous condition because you put them on notice that there's a dangerous condition. And yeah, I think all of the things that you suggested that they do are great steps and great ideas, and I certainly would have advised them the same thing. So I think you were right on the money. There's another issue is, you could put like the reflecting tape or like carpet tape down just to alert that there's a high step there. Like you said, some type of cone or barrier or some type of signage, because, typically if you can't correct a dangerous condition, the next best step is to warn about it.
Right, exactly. Which is why sometimes you walk on the sidewalk and you see like the four cones around like, the tree root or something so that people are forced to walk around it.
Exactly.
See that a lot in downtown. And so I think the last couple of thoughts that I had, one is you mentioned the sidewalk, right? So are homeowners, are they responsible for maintaining the sidewalk, or is it the city's responsibility and they just call the city? Like what is this maintenance requirement and why might they be liable for a slip and fall on the sidewalk?
Yeah, so it depends. Sometimes you can be, and one of the best examples is the one that I gave, which is, let's say you have a tree on your property that you're
Mhm.
responsible for maintaining, and the root intrusion from your tree is what's causing the sidewalk to lift. Now, generally, maintenance of the sidewalks is typically a city responsibility, but there's a bit of a shared responsibility when it comes to the sidewalk because the problem with the sidewalk could originate from your home. And so,
Okay.
there are situations where you may be, as the homeowner, liable, even though typically maintenance of streets and sidewalks is a city responsibility. There may be reasons why you're liable.
So thank you for that. That makes perfect sense. And then the last thing that I kind of want to really think about or talk about is, we talk about liability, right? And we say, are you liable or are you not liable? And sometimes you're liable and sometimes you're not liable as a homeowner. But let's say, you get sued because somebody thinks you should be liable. Like, do the legal bills magically go away
Certainly
to
not. Yeah,
to defend yourself?
so you certainly would hope, obviously, that the legal system works properly, and that if there is a frivolous lawsuit that is filed, meaning something that does not have merit or something that realistically you should not be liable for, you would hope that the legal system catches it in what's called like a summary judgment phase, which is basically the defense, you asking the court to throw the case out because there's really no basis in law to hold you liable. The problem with that is, as a homeowner, to get to that stage where you've gotten enough evidence to allow the court to throw out the case, there could be pretty extensive legal bills that get you to that point. And so, just know that if somebody were to, make a lawsuit and you had to defend yourself, there could still be legal bills. Now, there are some provisions in the law to try to get those costs back. But obviously it can take a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of stress in your life to defend yourself from these types of claims. And that's why, at the end of the day, it really is best practice to, really just try to make your property as safe as you can, and try to avoid ever having to be in that lawsuit situation.
Exactly. And also, sometimes the provisions in the law say, okay, the prevailing party is responsible for paying the other party's legal bills, but in order for the prevailing party to pay the legal bills, they actually have to have the money to pay them.
Absolutely. Yeah, and they may not be collectible at the end of the day. That's definitely
Right.
a good point. And obviously you would hope that if you're sued for something that happens on your property, that your homeowner's insurance will, do the right thing and tender, a defense for you. But that's not always the case. There may be reasons why they don't. And even if they do, there may be some still stress and time that you are having to expend in defending that lawsuit.
Yeah. And also, if it's an expensive lawsuit, like I don't think $100,000 in legal bills is that unreasonable or unlikely getting to the summary judgment phase. And so, I mean, your insurance company is not going to like you if they have to pay $100,000 in legal bills.
Yeah, I certainly don't think that an insurance company is going to want to spend that kind of money. Obviously, they have their obligations to act in good faith, and you hope that they do. But it's certainly not fun for anybody to have to defend a lawsuit.
Right. So that's awesome. Well, thank you for that, Jessica. I feel like that was extremely helpful. Do you have any final thoughts other than, this really good takeaway that really try to make your house as safe as possible. Make sure that you understand what your liabilities are, so that if something does happen, then you can just be like, look, there's no claim here at all. You can't sue me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the excellent takeaway from it. At the end of the day, you really just want to be acting as that quote unquote reasonable person, and do your best diligence, particularly if you're acting like as a landlord and renting out your property or something like that. Really make sure that you're doing some type of reasonable inspections of your property for dangerous conditions, anything that a person could encounter and that could injure them, and really just trying to remedy those conditions before it becomes a problem.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. And also, I know that lawyers are super busy. And so I really appreciate your taking time out of your busy, busy day just to talk to us and give us some insight about, how to keep our homes safe and what we can do to, have parties, have people over, have people walk by our houses without suddenly getting this like magical lawsuit that shows up because somebody slipped and fell outside of our property or whatever. And I always close out by asking my guests if our listeners think that you are as awesome as I think you are, how can they get a hold of you?
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'll just say first, thank you so much for having me on. This was super fun. Great to talk about something that I do day to day and have a passion for. But certainly, if anyone has any questions and wants to talk to me about one of my favorite subjects, you can always email me. My email is Jessica, Jessica, @thegomezfirm.com.
Excellent. And I have popped that into the comments. It is the first comment on our live stream, so people can see that and talk to you about any questions they have. And also, I fully believe, I know that you're a litigator, but one of the important things about litigation, or one of the things that litigators can do, is they can help you mitigate your risk. So litigators sue people and they go and they fight in court, but the best litigators, like Jessica, will help make sure that you don't get to court beforehand.
The first place, I agree.
Yes. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And I will be on next week with another awesome guest, I assume, talking about another interesting real estate fact. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.